Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Puddles and today we're doing another encounter building video. Today we're going to talk about initiative, different ways that we can perhaps use initiative and the pros and cons to these ways. But let's just jump in. So the two main ways of rolling for initiative are grouped initiative and individual initiative. So grouped initiative is when you roll initiative for each group. So your players will each roll initiative for themselves, and then if you have a group of ogres and then a group of orcs and a group of goblins, the goblins will roll, the orcs, and then the ogres, and they'll go on those initiative rolls. The second way is individual initiative. So each of your players will roll their individual initiative, and then you will roll initiative for every single creature. So if there are 3 goblins, one goblin will roll initiative, then another goblin will roll initiative, and then another goblin roll initiative. So, what's good or bad about both of these different styles? Well, with the grouped initiative, let's talk about the pros. First, it's easier to set up. When you're initially rolling initiative, you only have to think about the groups. You don't have to think about the individual. So the setting up combat is quicker. It's easier to track during combat. You have goblins, so you do your actions with every one of your goblins. Easy. And it's also good for pacing. If you have big combats with lots of moving parts, it's easy to have your groups moving and doing their things together. Well, not necessarily moving together, but doing whatever they're doing at the same time. Things that are not as great about the grouped initiative are less combat dynamics. If there's only 2 groups of monsters, they only get 2 turns. Obviously, there are multiple creatures in those turns doing their things, but it doesn't feel the same. It just feels like they've got less actions, even though they will each do their thing on their turn. Whereas the players, if there's 5 of them, they'll have 5 goes. They can rely on a variation of creatures. So if you're using this initiative system, you might be, instead of putting in 5 goblins, I'll put in 2 goblins, a wolf, and a goblin leader so that they all get their own initiative. So you have to rely on varying the different creatures, which in my opinion makes for better combat anyway, but you do rely on that. And it can create swingy fights. If you have one big group of kobolds and they roll a 20 on their initiative, they all get to go before your players, and it can really swing the combat in their favor. There we go, brain. Okay, so that's a little background on that type of initiative rolling. Next, we have the individual initiative. So, what's good about it? Well, fights are less swingy. If you have 10 creatures all going on the same action, it's definitely going to be one hell of an action. But if those 10 creatures are spread out in different parts of the combat, it's going to be more balanced in that way. It feels more realistic. In a real fight, obviously D&D combat isn't like a real fight, but not, a race of one peoples doesn't fight and then wait, and then another group does another fight. Like, it makes more sense that the creatures individually would do what they're doing on their turn. And it's also good for tactical and combat variation in terms of the DM. It gives you... So if all your creatures go on one turn, that's their turn. You don't... If anything happens in between those turns, you don't have the option to react to that. You have to wait until a whole turn cycle until it's their go again. Whereas if it's split up in different parts, you have more control over how they react to things like that. Cons, it can really slow or stop the flow of combat. If you've got so many moving parts that you've got to think about, it can really overwhelm the combat and really slow it down. It's harder to manage, especially with bigger groups. If you've got 10 creatures, you have to roll initiative for all 10 creatures. And this is also why it takes a lot longer to set up the fight. So a lot of the pros for one are the cons for the other. which makes sense. But before we continue, let's just have a look at these two combats here. So we've got a whole bunch of kobolds on one side, and then a whole bunch. Well, we have a few ogres and a couple of orcs. So let's do the grouped initiative. Let's just set up an initiative, and obviously with Roll20, it gives you all of these tools that it makes it a lot easier. If you're doing this at home with pen and paper, your system might not be as quick as this either. So let's just do the grouped. So, all right, initiative. Boop. Kobolds. Initiative. Kobold Dragon Shield. Okay, initiative Winged Kobold. Doop. And then initiative. So I have 4 different groups here. That was super easy, super quick. And while my players are rolling their initiative, I could have done that easily. Now, in combat, however, my kobolds rolled a 19. So these 6-7 creatures are probably going to go well before anybody else, and that's really going to factor into the fight. So even though setting up the combat was a lot easier, the combat itself might be a lot more swingy. Whereas if we look over here, doop, doop. Oh, sorry. Let's get this out here. So my ogre initiative, and then my orc initiative. So that was also really quick. But I've only got 2 groups. So if my players have 5, if there are 5 players, it will be, player, ogre, player, orc, player, ogre. They don't get as many actions. So you could see how in this specific situation, it might be better to do individual initiative. Now, basically what I'm trying to get across is you don't have to choose one or the other all the time. You don't have to be, I'm only ever using grouped initiative. You can look at the combat itself, see what the pros and cons of each of these are, and pick. For instance, if I was to use these ogres and these orcs, I would probably do the individual initiative because there are less creatures. So the cons of it being hard to manage and being longer to set up and stopping the flow of combat, I don't have to think about them because there's only 5 creatures. Whereas if I was doing the kobold fight, I would probably do the grouped initiative because the cons of the less combat dynamics, and the swingy fights, there's still cons in there, but the less dynamics has been countered by the variation. It's just it depends on the fight as to what initiative you want to use. Or if you want, you can just always do grouped, or you can always do individual. It's entirely up to you. You're the DM. You're the one in charge of this sort of stuff. But yeah, basically just think about how the flow, how the balance, and I think the flow of combat and the balance and managing the combat, whether you've got too many things to think about. Those are the 3 main things that you should think about when it comes to initiative. And now, for fun, right at the end, let's have a look at some variant rules. So these are all in the DMG. I don't think any of these are really good at all, but let's talk about them anyway. So there's the initiative score. So instead of rolling initiative, everyone just goes off of their dex. So if you have high dex, you always go first. If you have low dex, you always go last. It's really easy. It's simple. But there's no dynamics. Every rogue is going to go first. Every strength barbarian with no dex is going to go last. There's no flexibility in that. There's no variation, and it seems boring to me. I like the randomness in the rolling of initiative. So that's why I don't think that one is a very, very good one. The next is side initiative. So the players choose one person, and the DM, they each roll a d20, and then each side of the combat takes its turn as a group. So you as a DM, if you roll higher, you use all of your creatures and then they go. Then on the player's turn, all of the players go. It's good for the players setting up wombo combos or doing cool stuff like that. And good for team synergy. but it will create crazy swingy fights. Whoever gets to go first is going to have the biggest advantage. Like you can, it's a silly system in my eyes. Others might think differently, but yeah, just the fact that one whole side of the combat gets to go first is just a bad idea to me. But others may think differently. And then, whoa, let's move this up. We have the speed factor. So this one's a little bit more complex. Basically, initiative is rolled every round instead of just at the start of combat. Players and monsters declare actions before initiative is rolled and then get speed modifiers depending on what action they take. So if you're casting a spell, you'll have like a -2, depending on what level spell, you have a -2 to your initiative roll. But if you are a rogue with a finesse weapon, you get a +2 because it's a light, quick thing. And then you roll it every round. This one is like, if combat wasn't already too truncated and complex, this would be a cool way of doing it, I think. If you could get players into it, because it does give you it gives you a lot more options, and it definitely changes how combat would feel. I mean, I've never run this. This is just what I assume, but like combat is already pretty clunky in a lot of ways and complicated for new players. So adding in this whole new level of like tracking everyone's initiative every round would also slow the crap out of the combat. Just seems too clunky to me. But yeah, it's there if you guys want to try it out in the DMG. But yeah, so this is just a quick video on initiative and how you don't necessarily have to do it one way or the other. You can pick. I usually go with the grouped initiative and stick to relying on the variation of creatures. But if you want, you can just roll initiative for each creature if you want to do that. It's all up to you. I think they are both equally as good as each other, and it really depends on the situation as to which you should use. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful, and yeah, see you then.